Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Midnight Hunt Draft Guide. In this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know to get ready for your Midnight Hunt drafts. But before I dive in, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more content, and leave a comment in the comment section down below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Without further ado, let's get to it. In this guide, I'm going to be discussing the set mechanics, the top 3 commons by color, archetype overviews, combat tricks, traps, combos, and more. So let's get to it. The set mechanics are Day and Night, Disturb, Coven, Decayed tokens, and Flashback making a return. So the way Day and Night works in this set is that it starts out as no day or night. So the game is just going as normally, and then as soon as a card gets played that makes it day or night, it is then permanently day or night for the entire game for both players. So for example, once it becomes day, it is day, and then as it becomes day, you transform all nightbound permanents. If a player casts no spells during their own turn, it becomes night next turn. So then on the next person's turn, if it flips, it becomes night. And as it becomes night, you transform all daybound permanents. Permanents enter the battlefield nightbound, which is a pretty interesting twist for your flip cards that have nightbound. And then if a player casts at least 2 spells during their own turn, it becomes day next turn. So an important distinction with this one, when compared to ones in the past, was that the active player has to be the one casting 2 spells if it wants to go from night to day, or they have to cast no spells for it to go from day to night. So if you cast a spell on your opponent's turn and they don't cast any spells, it'll still go to night. So let's see how this works with an actual card example, Tavern Ruffian. So when it enters the battlefield, if it is neither day nor night, it becomes day. And then when you don't cast a spell on your own turn, it will flip into Tavern Smasher because it will become nighttime, and then that is a 6/5. So you get a significant stats increase when it does become nighttime, and if it's already nighttime, you get a 4-mana 6/5 because it will enter in its nightbound mode. So it's a kind of complex mechanic, but it's definitely worth understanding, and once you start playing with it, it'll make a lot more sense. Moving on to the next mechanic, which is Disturb. This is a mechanic that lets you get extra values from your creatures once they die or find their way to the graveyard. So for example, Baithook Angler, it's a 2-mana 2/1, but you may cast it from your graveyard transformed for its Disturb cost, which is 2 mana, 1 in a blue, and you'll get the Hook Haunt Drifter, which is a 1/2 flyer. So it's a different creature on the front and back side, but you are getting that extra value stapled onto your creature if it somehow finds its way to your graveyard. So you're getting a little bit of a perk on your creatures. Moving on to the next new mechanic, Coven. This is a mechanic that cares about having 3 creatures with different powers. So if you have a 1-powered creature, a 2-powered creature, and a 3-powered creature, Coven will be enabled, or any mix of 3 powers. 0 power does count as a power for this case, which is important to note because there are some 0-powered creatures in the set. And then you'll get a little bit of a benefit. So for example, Candlelit Cavalry will be a 5/5 trampler instead of just a vanilla 5/5 if you do have the Coven enabled. Moving on to Decayed, this is a type of token that you can make, and they are all 2/2 zombies. So it's a 2/2 zombie that can't block, and when it attacks, you sacrifice it at the end of combat. So if you're being aggressive with it, it can only attack 1 time, so it'll go away at the end of combat. But there are a host of other ways to use them, such as sacrificing them for value or tapping them to some effect or another. So you're going to want to keep an eye out for ways you can use the zombie tokens for more than just a little bit of incidental damage, though that is certainly relevant. So for example, Diregraph Horde is a 5-mana creature that when it enters play, you create 2 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decayed. So you get a ton of creatures into play all at once, but 2 of those are fragile and can't block. So very interesting mechanic as well. Next up is Flashback, which is a returning mechanic. It's not super complicated. It is on instants and sorceries, and it lets you cast the card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, sometimes with a slightly different effect. So with Secrets of the Key, you cast it for its front half and you investigate, but if you cast it on its back half, you from the flashback cost, you investigate twice. So that costs a little bit more, but you can cast it from the graveyard. Investigate is a mechanic in this set, as noted on Secrets of the Key, but it only appears on 1 common, Secrets of the Key, and 1 uncommon, so it's not really a full set mechanic like these other ones are, where you'll see them everywhere. And so Investigate, basically you create a clue token, and then you can pay 2 mana to sacrifice that clue token to draw a card. So it's not a super complicated one, and it doesn't come up all that often, but it's worth knowing how it works. Moving on to the top commons now, starting off with white. At number 1 is Gavany Silversmith. This is just a very effective way to buff up your creatures as a little bit of a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, just crush your opponent type deal. It is worth noting that you can put one of the counters onto itself, so if you only have one friend for him to buff, you still get a benefit, and you get to use both of those counters. And you can also use Gavany Silversmith to help you enable your Coven cards, because by putting those counters on certain creatures, you can probably finagle a way to get 3 different powers in play. So a very nice top-end land card for your aggressive decks that also works with some of the set mechanics. At number 2 is Candle Trap, which is a very cheap interactive spell. It's especially good in defensive decks because you don't really care that you've given your opponent's creature defender then, because like all you care about is it not being able to attack you. If you are an aggressive deck, the creature will still be able to block, but it is important to note that that creature will still take damage even though it doesn't deal damage. So if you put this onto their 3/2 creature and they block your 2/2 with it, that creature will die without you having to activate the extra ability. And because of the extra ability, it does mean you'll be able to clear out those pesky blockers as long as you can have multiple creatures with different powers into play. So if you can enable Covenant, it's just a good removal spell, and otherwise it's a nice little defensive removal spell, which is a little bit worse on offense, but it's still so efficient that it's worth running in your aggressive decks. And then at number 3 is Search Party Captain, which is a great card advantage card for the white decks. It puts a reasonable body into play for relatively cheap if you are attacking. And so if this costs 3 mana consistently and sometimes even less, it's going to be very good. And the default of 4 mana is not too bad. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Organ Hoarder. This card is very, very powerful. Just gets you a nice 2-for-1 right away, and it fuels your graveyard. So if you have any graveyard synergies, it can help you enable those. And overall, it just gives you a nice card filtering, card advantage effect attached to a reasonable body, which is very powerful. At number 2 is Consider. This card may look like a little bit of a sleeper because it is small and doesn't have a huge impact, but the fact that the card goes to your graveyard instead of to like the bottom of your library or something like that is very important because it lets you enable your graveyard synergies. It lets you flip potentially a flashback card into your graveyard or a disturb card into your graveyard, and overall it's just really effective in this type of format because the graveyard matters so much. You can also use it to double spell. So if it is nighttime and you really want it to go back to daytime, you can use Consider plus another card to turn it back to daytime relatively easily. And then you can also use it to fuel Spells Matters cards because there is an Instants and Sorceries Matters theme in blue-red, and so Consider is right at home in that deck. Also, if you get enough Considers, you can start running a couple fewer lands because if you have something like 3 Considers, all of a sudden it's easier to hit those land drops, so you can maybe shave a land, which is nice. At number 3 is Locked in the Cemetery, which is a nice removal spell for your blue decks. If you are being attacked, it's just going to keep that creature locked down, and then in the middle stages of the game, if you're using some graveyard shenanigans, you can even start tapping those creatures down proactively, so you don't have to get attacked by them first. So it's a nice removal spell for blue. Moving on to black, it's removal all the way down the line here. At number 1 is Defenestrate. Kills basically all of the creatures you care about. Sure, missing on flyers is not the best, but it's also really easy to cast at only a single black pip and kills most of the big ground creatures you're going to be worried about. Actually, all of the ground creatures because it destroys any creature without flying. And then at number 2 is Eaten Alive. This card can just be a 5-mana removal spell, but there are tons of decayed zombie tokens running around which are perfect to sacrifice to this, and that's going to be giving you a super efficient removal spell. And then it even exiles the creature, so if it is a disturbed creature, they're not going to get that extra value, so that's another nice bit of upside as well. And then at number 3 is Olivia's Midnight Ambush, another great removal spell, and especially efficient if it is nighttime. The only reason this isn't higher on the list is because black doesn't necessarily have a ton of ways to make it daytime or nighttime itself, so you have to pair it selectively with cards that are going to be able to cause it to be daytime or flip into nighttime, because otherwise it's just going to be -2/-2 in your deck, unless of course your opponent is causing it to be day or nighttime, but that's a little bit of more situational than some of these other black removal spells that are just always going to be doing what their maximum potential is generally. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Moonrager's Slash. Just a very powerful card because 3 mana to deal 3 damage to any target is already a card that is very good. And then if you're doing it for 1 mana, that's Lightning Bolt. That's really powerful. That card is fantastic and just so efficient that it's going to dominate games. So Moonrager Slash is absolutely fantastic, and it's the perfect card to have in your werewolves deck because you can pass the turn without doing anything, flip all of your werewolves, and then it's nighttime and your Moonrager Slash is also a lot better. At number 2 is Lamholt Harrier. This is the most consistently good red 2-drop, and so that's going to be very important for enabling your curve out decks. There are some other red 2-drops, but those ones aren't necessarily as at home in every deck, and so the Lamholt Harrier is going to be a key piece of your aggressive decks. And the fact that it can make a creature unable to block is super nice because it means that as you're curving out, you just have this threat where your opponent just has to leave back extra blockers if they want to actually be able to interact with you in combat. So it makes your removal spells better. It makes them harder for them to pressure you as well if you're racing them. And so overall, Lamholt Harrier is just a nice, great 2-drop for your decks. At number 3 is Immolation. It works well in aggressive decks for clearing out their blockers in the early game, and it also works well in defensive decks for if you're being attacked and you need to get rid of their early drops. It's also nice to have the option of sometimes having something like a relatively sizable creature, and you can just use the Immolation onto your own creature and use it to get 2 extra points of damage to your opponent. So that can be a nice little way to finish a game. So keep that in mind that you can cast it on your own creatures, but you're generally going to be using it to kill your opponent's creatures. Moving on to the green top commons, at number 1 is Shadow Beast Sighting. A 4 mana 4/4 is just a pretty solid body, and the fact that you can get another 4/4 for 7 mana means that you're really going to be able to take over the late game with this card, so just a great common for green. At number 2 is Eccentric Farmer. It just gets you a nice little bit of card advantage because the body gets you a land when it comes into play and can even mill your flashback cards or fuel your graveyard synergies, and so the farmer is going to do good work in those situations. If you ever mill a flashback card and get a land from this, it's going to feel like you're getting away with something. And then at number 3 is Duel for Dominance. This is another card that works well with werewolves because you can pass the turn to let your werewolves flip and then duel for dominance with your newly enhanced creatures because they've now grown because it'll be nighttime. So that's another one good use for Duel for Dominance. You can also just use this on your opponent's turn if they're going for some shenanigans, and you are hopefully going to be able to enable Coven to get a really nice discount on a effect that is typically costing 4 mana at sorcery speed. So there's a lot to like about Duel for Dominance. Moving on to some color rankings, I just want to first say that all of the colors are pretty powerful. There's not like an overwhelmingly best color or overwhelmingly worst color, so don't like hard avoid any colors or things like that. But at number 1 is black. It just gets some great removal spells, and it also has some solid creatures to back it up and some good decayed zombie token themes. At number 2 is red. It gets some great aggression, some good removal spells, and overall just has a lot of powerful cards. At number 3 is white. It's got good aggression, it's got good creatures. It does kind of have some cards that can play defense as well, so that's nice. And then blue gets some nice flashback cards, some zombie things, but it overall is a little bit less deep and doesn't have that aggressive plan as much. And then green is coming in and back just because it has a little bit weaker cards overall, but it's by no means like a big step down. So you're happy playing any of these colors. This is just a ranking of if you really have to make a tiebreaker pick, maybe you bias towards black a little bit and a little bit away from green. Moving to the archetype overviews, first we're going to be looking at the red-white deck. This is an interesting one because it cares about day/night, but it doesn't actually have as many werewolves because there aren't any werewolves in white, and so you're just using it for cards like Sunrise Cavalier and Gavony Dawnguard to get some advantages or get some counters on your creatures with those things, and then you also get access to some good removal, some good cheap creatures, and then the card Sacred Fire is just very powerful, and so that's one of the perks of being a red-white deck is you get to cast Sacred Fire. Moving on to blue-black, this is a zombies deck that can be a little bit aggressive because if you use Blade Stitch Scab and something like Falcon Abomination, all of a sudden you're getting a nice curve out going. And then it also has the ability to use those decayed tokens with cards like Siege Zombie, where instead of having to attack and lose those tokens, you can then start tapping them to just make your opponent lose 1 life and then maybe attack them at the end once that you've gotten them low. So a nice little aggressive deck in here. And there's also some defensive options. There's just the classic blue-black control deck with removal, card advantage, and then maybe just slowly grinding your opponent out. Moving on to green-white, this is the deck that mostly cares about Coven. It has some nice cards like Dawnheart Mentor, which can really help you enable Coven by getting you a 0-powered creature and a 1-powered creature, which are 2 of the harder powers to get, and then pretty much any other creature you're going to have your Coven enabled, which is really nice, and then gives you a nice late-game ability. Dawnheart Wardens also works really well with that, because once you've got Coven enabled, it's buffing all of your creatures, and then there is a little bit of a go-wide theme. Dawnheart Mentor makes 2 creatures, Join the Dance can make a bunch of creatures, and then there is a Mass Pump spell that can also help you go wide as well. So a lot of little micro synergies working together in green-white, and mostly focused around the Coven mechanic when you're going for that high synergy. Moving on to blue-red, this is the spells, instants, and sorcery specifically matter deck. You've got cards like Arcane Infusion, which is a nice little card selection / card advantage source if you do have a ton of instants and sorceries. You've got Storm Skrillex, which can hit for a ton of damage out of nowhere if you are able to kind of combo off with your instants and sorceries. And then you've got Seize the Storm as a nice payoff, among other payoffs, that lets you just make a big creature and then make another big creature when you flash it back. So if you have enough instants and sorceries going, they'll probably go into this blue-red deck, and you can build a really powerful concoction that's really fun to play and gets you a lot of cool value. Moving on to green-black, this is another great value deck. You can use cards like Morbid Opportunist to just get great value every time you use one of your premium black removal spells. It also triggers when one of your decay tokens dies, so if you have some of those running around from your black cards, that's going to be pretty nice. You also gain access to Diagraph Rebirth, which is a nice value card for getting back all of your key cards that you want, especially things like Grizzly Ghoul, which are just going to be completely massive if you're able to make some trades or attack with some decayed tokens or have some sacrifice synergies going before you cast it. So casting this as a 6/5 is not an unreasonable thing to expect if you're able to have some creatures trade or things like that. It does trigger on your opponent's creatures as well, so that's worth noting as well. All 3 of these cards do. So keep that in mind. Killing your opponent's creatures will trigger these. Moving on to blue-white, this is a color that has a lot of disturb in it. It's got Devoted Graftkeeper, which is going to be a nice little 2-drop that can maybe find you one of your disturb cards, and then whenever you cast one, you get to tap a creature so you can keep attacking. It's got Chaplain of Alms, which is a nice little aggressive drop. It wears +1/+1 counters very well. And then you've got Overwhelmed Archivist, which can be a nice card for like drawing and discarding, so you can get those disturb cards into the graveyard, churn through your deck. And then they all flip into relatively decent, like relatively good flyers. So they're all like 2-powered flyers. So they're all going to be able to like attack through and push through those last points of damage. So the way disturb is going to play out is you're going to play your little ground guys early in the game, get some points of damage in, and then when you're bringing them back from the graveyard, they have evasion, so it's harder for your opponent to fight the second wave of your creatures. So a really nice little benefit there for your blue-white deck. Moving on to red-green, this is the color that has the most werewolves. You've got cards like Kessig Naturalist, which is a 2/2 that can attack and help ramp out your other cards. You've got Village Watch, which is going to be able to, a nice little curve topper. And then you've got Hound Trainer, which is just a fantastic card that has a lot of threat of activation with its ability. And then if you do pass a turn without doing anything, you flip them all into their werewolf counterparts. The Lord of the Ulvenwald buffs all of your other werewolves. The Village Reavers gives all of your wolves and werewolves haste, which is especially powerful because if it's already nighttime, all of a sudden you're casting these massive werewolves and they have haste. And then the Untamed Pup will then give your wolves and werewolves trample, which is really a nice effect once your creatures have grown to massive sizes. So this one's going to be really fun to assemble and then just watch them all flip at once and try to attack your opponent down. Next up is white-black. This is a sacrifice deck. It's got cards like Flesh Taker, which can sacrifice your other creatures. Especially of note, you're going to make sure you have cards to sacrifice. So Decayed Zombie tokens are the perfect choice for that because they aren't really doing a ton on their own. You also have cards like Rite of Oblivion, which can be a great removal spell if you do have some extra fodder lying around. And then Odric's Outrider really rewards you for whenever one of your other creatures dies, you can kind of throw counters around. So especially if you have something like Flesh Taker in play, all of a sudden you attack with your creatures and your opponent never knows how big they're going to be because you can like sacrifice one creature to buff up another creature and really just make combat nightmare for the opponent. So get those sacrifice the sacrifice cards, the cards to sacrifice, and you're going to be finding yourself with a good deck here. Moving on to green-blue, this is a graveyard-themed deck that also focuses a little bit on ramping up and casting those powerful spells. It can even do a little bit of splashing, which is nice. So it's got the card Root Coil Creeper, which can tap for 1 mana of any color, which is already a fantastic card. But then if you're casting spells from the graveyard, it taps for 2, which is just fantastic, especially when you're casting a card that is really expensive to flash back, like Rise of the Ants, because you can cast the first half, and then normally it takes a while to get from 6 to 8 mana. But with your Root Coil Creeper, you can do that at an accelerated pace. And then you can use a card like Phantom Carriage to find those flashback cards or those disturb cards that you might want so that you can get those extra value from your graveyard. So it's a nice value graveyard deck that can also sometimes splash powerful cards. So blue-green looks like a lot of fun. There's also red-black, which is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It's aggressive, it cares about vampires, it cares about attacking, it cares about dealing damage. So the Vampire Socialite is the perfect card for this deck. Not only does it have, it's just a 2-mana 2/2 menace, which is already a great card, but it also makes all of your other vampires buffed up if it enters the battlefield and they've taken damage. And if you deal damage to them and then play a vampire, that vampire will also get a counter. It plays perfectly with Vampire Interloper, which has evasion, comes down early in the game, and is really difficult to deal with as the game goes on. And then you can use these early drops that let you get through for damage to trigger things like Voldaren Ambusher, which cares about how many vampires you have in play and if you've done damage to the opponent, which, as you can see from the Interloper and the Socialite, that's exactly what those cards are looking to do as well. And so they really all play synergistically well together, and it's like a vampire aggro deck that cares about dealing damage to the opponent, which, let's be honest, aggro decks tend to want to deal damage to the opponent, so that's kind of playing into the theme perfectly. Moving on to the combat tricks in the set, there are 3 in white to be aware of: Blessed Defiance, Flare of Faith, and Ritual of Hope. It's important to note that these cards only give +2 power, with the exception of Flare of Faith, which can give +3/+3 if there is a human being targeted, so just keep that in mind. Blessed Defiance works best when you're targeting something that was like, you don't care about it dying, so it works pretty well with a Decayed Zombie token, because you can attack with like a couple of zombie tokens, and then your opponent maybe blocks the one that they're able to block, thinking you were just chumping, and then you use Blessed Defiance, get that creature that they blocked with out of the way permanently, and then you even, when your creature dies, which you knew it was going to die anyway, you get a 1/1. Flare of Faith works especially well with humans. It's overall just a relatively solid combat trick, though it's a little bit expensive if you don't have human synergies. And then finally, Ritual of Hope is a great card for if you are using that Go Wide Coven stuff that we mentioned earlier. In blue, there are 2 different cards that give -2, -0, so the fact there's multiple of these means you should definitely be aware of them, especially if your opponent makes an attack that seems sketchy, so just keep those in mind. If they're attacking their 3/3 into your 3/3, maybe keep these cards in mind. In black, there isn't really a conventional combat trick, but there is Blade Brand, which means that any creature is going to be able to trade up. So if they attack their 2/2 into your 5/5, and you are getting some suspicious vibes, maybe they have Blade Brand, so you won't want to block, or things like that, or you'll want to block with your 3/3 instead if they only have black mana, so you don't lose your bigger creature. And then red, it has 3 combat tricks to be aware of. Lunar Frenzy is fantastic. It can be very flexible because you can either cast it for like X equals 7 or things like that in the late game, so you just fireball your opponent, or even just X equals 0, where all you care about is giving your creature first strike so it wins a combat. So that's a really nice bit of flexibility for Lunar Frenzy. There's also Raise the Effigy, which is very, very less so flexible because it only does one thing, buffs up your attacking creatures. It can be a nice little card to have in your deck, but it's not super powerful, so you aren't going to want to run it all the time. And then Stolen Vitality has a little bit of flexibility as well. You don't generally want to cast combat tricks on defense, so I would caution you against doing that unless you absolutely have to. But the first strike does mean that it does have a little bit of extra utility on defense, and then on offense you can get through for some tremendous damage if your opponent doesn't block correctly against it. There are some more combat tricks in green, but I wanted to be able to show them all on the same page so you can be aware of all the things you need to worry about. So Clear Shot isn't always really viewed as a combat trick because it is just a fantastic removal spell, but it is worth noting as a combat trick because it is at its most devastating when you attack with a 3/3, they block with a 3/3, and then you use Clear Shot, kill their other creature, and also win the combat. So that's where it's at its best. And so if your opponent makes an attack against you, you're going to want to be aware that Clear Shot exists. So make sure you don't get blown out by that. And another great card that can blow out opponents is Defend the Celestis. This is the sort of card where the game just looks fairly normal, and then all of a sudden they cast Defend the Celestis, and it's over because just all of the trades that you were going to make just don't work out. So if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, being aware of this is definitely worth noting. And it can even enable Coven because you can like move those counters around to try and put different powers on creatures. So if you need to enable Coven, you can even cast it at sorcery speed or something like that. And then the 2 common combat tricks in green are Howl of the Hunt and Might of the Old Ways, and it's important to note that both of these give +2/+2. So typically, if you're only playing around commons, the common power and toughness boost you're going to have to be aware of is +2/+2 for green. Howl of the Hunt and Might of the Old Ways both get a little bit of an advantage when they do come into play a lot of the time. So Howl of the Hunt stays around permanently. Might of the Old Ways replaces itself if Coven is enabled. So keep that in mind and try not to get blown out by these because it could lose you the game if they get a nice 2-for-1 with their combat trick. Moving on to some cards that are traps. Otherworldly Gaze is just not worth playing. It looks like the sort of card that might give you some sort of advantage, but because you never actually draw a card with it, you're basically just spinning your wheels, putting cards into your graveyard, and actually just putting yourself down a card, which is not worth it. Duress is another card that looks like it's going to trade for one of your opponent's cards, but it's generally just too likely to either whiff or just trade with a card that they has flashback or something like that. So it's not the sort of card that you're going to want to put in your deck, even though it might look like, oh, I got to see my opponent's hand and do some stuff. Just don't play Duress. It'll be you won't want to play Duress. Next up is Turn the Earth. This is the sort of card that can look like it is better than it is because it's an uncommon. So it's like, oh, it's an uncommon, it must be very good. But this is just an uncommon that's not worth playing because you're putting yourself down a card. Even if you're making them shuffle in their flashback cards, you're putting yourself down a card to do so, so you're kind of defeating the purpose of it, and the life gain is certainly not worth it either. So you're not going to want to play Turn the Earth. Similarly, the uncommon trap of Moonsilver Key, it's like, oh my gosh, this card must be great because it's an uncommon artifact, but the card is just way too expensive for the effect it has and is not worth playing, even if you need fixing. You'd probably just prefer to play a basic land of the type you would hope to get with Moonsilver Key. So if you're trying to splash black, it would probably just be better to play a Swamp than the Moonsilver Key because this is just so expensive and inefficient. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble in this set. The first one is between Purifying Dragon and Blade Brand. You basically cast Blade Brand on the dragon, and then when it pings something, the dragon has Death Touch, so that ping is going to be lethal no matter how big the creature. Definitely something to be aware of. Another black-red combo is Pax Betrayal and Eaten Alive or any other sacrifice effect. You basically steal your opponent's creature, attack them with it, and then sacrifice it to Eaten Alive and kill their other big creature. So it's a really nice little 1-2 punch there to be aware of. So make sure that if you are taking a lot of these sacrifice effects and you are playing a black-red deck, that you keep your eye out for that Pax Betrayal. You can even steal your opponent's wolf or werewolf and get an extra scry, which is pretty funny. So even if you don't control a wolf or werewolf immediately, in the way the card is worded, you'll get that scry too, because you control the werewolf by that time that part resolves. The next combo to be aware of is Dual Craft Trainer. and Lunar Frenzy. This can be a nice little one-turn kill combo where if you can pump enough mana into the Lunar Frenzy and then combine it with the Double Strike from Duelcraft Trainer, you can do absurd amounts of damage in one turn. You can also use the Lunar Frenzy to enable the Coven ability, so you can cast it at sorcery speed and then go to combat if you don't have Coven before you start. That's a little bit riskier because it does expose you to more blowout potential, but if your opponent has no mana up and you just really want to, and you have lethal on board, be aware that that's something you can do. And you can also just do it mid-combat if you've already got Coven enabled, like give the Duelcraft Trainer Double Strike and then just cast Lunar Frenzy mid-combat. It does work with other combat tricks as well, but Lunar Frenzy is the best one because it can just do tons of damage out of nowhere. The final combo to be aware of is Ardent Elementalist plus Geist Wave. Basically, the way that the Ardent Elementalist works is it can get back your Geist Wave from your graveyard, and then you can cast the Geist Wave to return the Ardent Elementalist to your hand, and because you controlled the permanent, you get to draw an extra card. So every time you do that loop, you're generating a card of advantage, and you're also able to do things like block with the Elementalist and then bounce it to your hand before damage happens. So not only are you generating card advantage, but you're also generating a lot of like blocking power as well. You can essentially blank one of their creatures, which is really annoying to deal with and definitely a powerful thing to be aware of. Moving on to the mana fixing in the set, there is Evolving Wilds here, which is going to be great in your 2-color decks for making sure you have more consistent mana, but also if you are splashing, it is especially important. Next up, there is Jack-O-Lantern, which is a nice little one-shot mana fixer, so if you are splashing, keep that card in mind, because if you have a couple Jack-O-Lanterns, you don't even need that many basics of the type that you're playing, because you can just play the Jack-O-Lantern, sacrifice it to replace itself, and get a little bit of extra utility there maybe, and then just wait until you draw your splash card and use the Jack-O-Lantern. So that's definitely something to be aware of. If you get a few of those, it definitely makes splashing a lot easier, and it's very cheap to use, so it's actually much better than it looks on its face. Face for the Jack-O-Lantern. Yes, classic puns almost. Next is Crossguard Candle Guide, another pumpkin card that fixes your mana. I don't know why pumpkins fix your mana, but that seems to be a recurring theme in this set. But the Candle Guide is a little bit clunky in many ways. It's a little bit understated for its cost, and you don't really want to be paying 2 mana to get only 1 back of the different color, but it's definitely something you can play to fix your mana in a pinch. Next is Mystic Skull. This card's a little bit tough to use because it does cost so much to transform it later, but it can filter your mana if you really need to, and then it does transform into a relatively sizable creature in the late game. So if you are planning on splashing and you need to go a little bit worse, I think it's worse than the Jack-O-Lantern, so keep that in mind. But it does give you another option of fixing. And then if you are going into green, you gain access to a little bit of extra stuff. Path to the Festival is definitely a nice card for fixing, even gets you a scry if you get a 3rd basic land type, and you can flash it back to help even ramp you up a little bit more. Dawnheart Rejuvenator can tap for any color, which is really nice. It is a little bit fragile. Relying on creatures to fix your mana can be tough, because if they kill the creature and you all of a sudden can't cast your spell, that's not great, but it can definitely help you provide those extra sources. And then Root Coil Creeper, we already saw, can tap for any color, so that's a nice little way to fix your mana as well. Moving on to some final tips here, we go to the last little section here. Cheap spells are especially useful for double spelling to make it day again. So during the game, if you do have some cheap spells, maybe instead of running those out, if they're not going to have a big impact, you can save them if it feels like it's going to be especially relevant to swap the game state from night to day. So if your opponent has a lot of werewolves, maybe being able to swap it back is really important for your game plan, so keep it in mind. Cheap spells are especially useful for that. And during the draft portion as well, you can prioritize cheap spells a little bit higher so that you can maybe flip it out of nighttime, because that can be really devastating, especially if they're just playing a bunch of werewolves in their nightbound mode and just getting these massive creatures. Another tip is that there's tons of value in this set with the Graveyard, Flashback, Disturb. There's a lot of creatures that enter the battlefield and get you an advantage of some kind. So the important thing to do in this sort of set where it feels like everything's a value play is to focus on card advantage that works with your game plan. So if you're playing a white deck, having the 4-drop that can put 2 counters on your creatures is going to be an important thing versus something that just draws you cards in your other color or something like that. You want to make sure that your card advantage is also advancing your game plan, because that'll give you an advantage over your opponents who just jam random sources of card advantage into their decks and then have kind of a disjointed plan. There's enough card advantage to find the ones that work with your game plan, and that is going to be a key to success in this set. That is going to do it for this draft guide, though. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more content, and leave a comment if you have any questions or feedback. And if you want to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag ready to hunt in the comments section down below. That's going to do it for this draft guide, though. I hope you're excited to dive into your Midnight Hunt draft, and I hope to see you in the queues. That's going to do it. I'll talk to you next time.